Understanding how to represent three-dimensional structures is essential to the drawing genre. Whether it is people, environments, or objects, it is essential to know how these three-dimensional structures fit in a three-dimensional space. In this tutorial, we will be looking at the rules of perspective and how to represent three-dimensional structures in an accurate way. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics, and in today's video we will be exploring perspective drawing. Now, it is important to understand that there is more than one point perspective. In the case of drawing, there are many ways to understand how we are looking at an environment, and in this tutorial what we will be breaking down is the process of how to represent some simple structures through the use of 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. Now, before we can create these complex environments, the intention is to first understand some elementary three-dimensional shapes and how to form these three-dimensional shapes through the principles of 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. Now, in the case of 1-point perspective, the way in which we're going to start is with our ruler and pencil, and this is where we simply establish a simple horizon line. 1-point perspective is the most simple way of defining a space using a set of principles to define its proportional accuracy. And what is meant by this is that by the use of 1-point perspective principles, we can easily establish three-dimensional structures in an accurate way that represents it in a realistic three-dimensional environment. Now, in the case of this tutorial, what we will be doing is drawing and representing very simple three-dimensional structures, and in this case we will be drawing a cube. Now, when drawing a cube in 1-point perspective, as the name suggests, what we will be seeing is only one part of the cube and how it is represented within a three-dimensional environment, shifting into this one vanishing point. And the vanishing point is basically the tool that describes the angle at which the object is being seen. Now, when it comes to perspective drawing, this is just a way to give the viewer a very unique point of view, vantage points, which allows the viewer to see the environment or the space represented in the drawing in a very unique way. However, when we start working with more than one vanishing point, it starts to kind of shift the way in which we view the object. But in the case of 1-point perspective, what we are dealing with here is seeing the object kind of at a front view, and this is going to also establish this quality of depth within the structure and how it sits within the environment as the structure moves towards that vanishing point and slowly starts to become smaller as it moves in the distance. Now, the idea here is that once we have drawn our horizon line and have set a vanishing point on our horizon line, we can start to draw a cube anywhere on our page, and the way in which we start this cube is by drawing a simple square. Now, once we have drawn in this simple square, the intention is to start working in these lines called vanishing lines, and this is where we start connecting the corners of the square to the vanishing point. By doing this, what we'll start to see is a cube-like structure forming that seemingly flows towards the distance. However, this is basically the way in which we are creating this quality of depth, where we establish a object or structure somewhere on our page and connect it to that vanishing point. And basically the concept of the vanishing point is to create that quality of depth, making the structure seemingly move towards the distance and therefore starting to get slightly smaller as it does so. So once we have created these vanishing lines, making sure we have connected the corners of the square to the vanishing points, we can start drawing another cube by using those vanishing lines to assist us. And what we'll find is that as we start to create another square using the lines of the vanishing point as demarcated lines to draw in another square, this will slowly start to establish a smaller square compared to that of the first square that we have drawn, and ultimately we will start to see a cube form in this three-dimensional space. Now again, the quality that is basically being established here is this quality of depth within the structure, and this is because we have drawn a large square, and then through the use of vanishing lines we have connected that square to the vanishing point, and using those vanishing lines we can then draw another square and ultimately use them to kind of establish three-dimensional structures that seemingly move from the foreground into the background. Now, once we have basically done this, we can actually start to play around with establishing squares in various areas of the page. The process is the exact same. So when you're working with a single vanishing point, what we can do is we can basically do the same thing with establishing various squares around the page, where we draw in these squares and basically just connect them to that single vanishing point. By doing so with those vanishing lines between the corners of the square to the vanishing points, we can use those lines to kind of demarcate the area in which we can draw other squares, and then slowly start to form these cube-like structures that are seemingly moving into the distance. Now, this is a process you can do not necessarily just underneath the horizon line, but you can start to do this on top of the horizon line. Where you draw these squares above the horizon line, you start to see that it shifts the angle at which the squares are viewed. Now again, as long as you establish these vanishing lines that connect to the corners of the structure that you're drawing and ultimately flow to that vanishing point, you can then use those vanishing lines as a means of demarcating an area in which you establish these structures or three-dimensional shapes. And as long as you use these principles, these key factors such as the vanishing lines and the vanishing point, you can always establish a realistic quality of a three-dimensional structure in a three-dimensional environment that seemingly shifts towards a distant point and kind of gives it that quality of becoming more small as the structure moves towards the distance. Now, you can play around with this concept again once you understand the rules of one-point perspective, where we use one vanishing point. We've established the horizon line, and then we start to use these vanishing lines to establish structures. We can then proceed to draw in as many structures as we like, but otherwise, yeah, this is the basic way in which we kind of create structures within a three-dimensional space through the use of a single one-point perspective vanishing point. Now we're going to start moving on to two-point perspective, and as the name suggests, this is where we're going to start working with two vanishing points. Now this is a little bit different and presents the viewer with a very unique perspective on the structure within the environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to start again with a simple horizontal line to establish the horizon line. However, this time we're going to draw in two vanishing points, and this is where we want to draw a vanishing point on the left side of the page on the horizon line and on the right side of the page of the horizon line. Now the intention here is that we're going to basically establish a cube structure which is basically seen from the angle of the cube. Now the way in which we do this is we want to start working in this vertical line somewhere on the page, and this is going to establish the corner of the cube. Once we have done that, what we want to do is from the top and the bottom of that vertical line, we want to connect vanishing lines to one of the vanishing points. Now the intention here is to kind of establish one side of the cube first, and then we'll start to use the other vanishing point to establish the other side of the cube. Now what we want to do is once we have that vertical line established somewhere on our page, we then want to connect it to the vanishing point by the integration of these vanishing lines, and those vanishing lines should connect between the vanishing points and the top and the bottom point of that vertical line. So basically we should have two vanishing lines that connect to the bottom and the top points of that vertical line. Once we have done that, we can draw in another vertical line within the space of those two vanishing points that runs parallel in a vertical direction that corresponds with that first vertical line. And again, this is basically already going to establish one side of the cube. So what we should see is one side of the cube or this parallelogram shape already established through the use of this first set of vanishing lines. Now what we're going to do is we're going to basically establish the bottom section of the cube, or the face that would sit on the ground, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the bottom corners of that first parallelogram shape and draw a line that connects from those bottom corners to the second vanishing point. Now this is where we basically start to establish the cube in the two-point perspective by using the second vanishing point. Now the intention here is to draw another set of vanishing lines that run from that second vanishing point to that first vertical line, and this is where we connecting those lines to both corners of that first vertical line, the top point and the bottom point. Once we have done that, we can do the same for that second vertical line, where we connect lines that run diagonally to that bottom corner and top corner of that second vertical line. Now what we will find is as we start to establish this cube using two-point perspective and using both of the vanishing points, all the lines will connect between the vanishing points and every corner of the cube. And that's basically how we assemble this cube. We start to assemble the corner points of the cube through the use of these two vanishing points and that first vertical line that establishes the corner angle of the cube that sits in the foreground. Now again, what we'll find is that we'd want to try and keep our vertical lines parallel to one another. Now every time we draw in these vertical lines, again, we want to make sure that they remain parallel to one another and that they are drawn within the space that is established by the two vanishing lines that shift towards the distance or the two vanishing points and kind of establish this effect of the object getting smaller as it shifts towards the distance. And in doing so, what we will find is a cube will naturally form simply by us integrating these diagonal lines that shift towards the foreground and are established between the first vertical line and the two vanishing points. So again, the first vertical line will always establish the corner angle of the structure and how it sits in the foreground. And as we use that first vertical line to then connect to the two vanishing points with these vanishing lines that run diagonally across either side of the page, we can then start to use the demarcated areas between those vanishing lines to set up the other corners or the vertical angles of that cube structure. And as we proceed with this, we'll find that those vanishing lines will then inevitably connect to all points of the cube. So the main key concepts with 2-point perspective is working with those two vanishing points, making sure you set the structure up in any place within the page. That's really up to you. However, you want to set up the corner vertical line of that cube structure first. From that vertical line, you can then start working with the points in that line and connecting it to the vanishing points with those vanishing lines. As you proceed, you'll find that naturally, by keeping all vertical lines parallel, you will find that inevitably a realistic three-dimensional cube will start to form through the use of those 2-point perspective principles. Now again, you can play around with how you establish this within the space. If you establish it below the horizon line, you will see the top surface of the cube structure, and if you set it above the horizon line, you will see the bottom surface area of that cube structure. Take your time kind of working with these principles. Sometimes you might find that at your first attempt it might be a little bit wonky or weird, but when it comes to perspective drawing, it really is a matter of using and sticking to the principles and making sure that you don't deviate from these key or core principles in order to establish three-dimensional objects in a realistic way, and how they are represented within a realistic three-dimensional environment. Now again, perspective drawing is simply a matter of creating a very unique point of view, vantage points that the viewer is seeing these structures from. And that's the point of perspective drawing. With that being said, we're going to shift into 3-point perspective, and 3-point perspective is a little bit different. It's similar to that of 2-point perspective, but as the name suggests, we're going to start working with a very unique set of 3 points. And this is where we can again establish a simple horizon line with 2 vanishing points on either side. Now the difference with 3-point perspective is where we start to establish these 2 vanishing points on the horizon line. However, what we want to do now is we're going to place a third vanishing point below the horizon line that kind of falls centrally between the first 2 vanishing points. Now you can place this third point quite below the horizon line, and that's up to you in terms of how large you would like your structure to be. The lower you place that third vanishing point, the more elongated the structure will be. Again, however, what we'll find is as we work below the horizon line, we will start to see the structure from a top point of view. Again, if you work below the horizon line, you'll always see the top surface area of the structure, and if you work above the horizon line, you will always see the bottom surface area of that structure. Now the first step is drawing the horizon line and the 2 vanishing points. Once again, we begin by drawing the horizon line, and basically the intention with the horizon line is to set up the eye level at which we are viewing the structures in the space. Now what we want to do is, once we have those 2 vanishing points set on the horizon line and a third one below our page and centrally placed below the 2 horizon lines, we want to connect diagonal lines from both those vanishing points to that third vanishing point at the bottom of the page. Now, by doing this, we are setting up the structural nature of this three-dimensional shape and how it is seen from this very unique three-point perspective angle. Now again, three-point perspective is very similar to that of two-point perspective, but due to the third vanishing points being placed below the horizon line, it creates a subtle distortion in the structure and gives it almost this fish-eyed angled points of view. So that's the difference between two-point perspective and three-point perspective, and what ultimately is the visual outcome. So what we'll find is, as we start connecting these diagonal lines from the two vanishing points on the horizon line to the third vanishing points below the center of the page, we are already establishing the corner of this cube structure. So once we have connected those diagonal lines, we can also then start to move on by drawing a vertical line that runs directly through the center of the page, perpendicular to that of our horizon line. And that should start from the third vanishing point. So the third vanishing point should basically be the bottom corner point of this cube-like structure that we are drawing, and we should draw a vertical line from that third vanishing point. From there, we can draw another set of vanishing lines from the two vanishing points on the horizon line that connect to that vertical line. And that can connect anywhere to the vertical line. So you can draw that vertical line extending all the way beyond the horizon line, or you can keep it under the horizon line. Again, that's just going to affect the way in which the structure is seen. However, what we do want to do is we just want to start connecting another set of vanishing lines that flow from the first two vanishing points on the horizon line, and we can make sure that that connects anywhere along that vertical line. Now, once we have done that, what we're going to do is we're going to establish another set of lines that form from each of those two vanishing lines, that second pair of vanishing lines, and that's going to establish the top surface area of our cube structure. Now, what we will find is that when we draw in vertical lines to establish the side angles of our cube, we're not drawing them perfectly vertical. However, what we are doing is we are drawing them from the two top corner points of our cube structure and flowing towards the third vanishing point. So that's going to bring our cube structure to a more narrow point, and again, that's just going to give that unique distortion, that fish-eyed angle that is very unique to the three-point perspective. So again, the main concepts to consider here is we are working with three vanishing points. Once we have established those three vanishing points, we can then start connecting them between one another with vanishing lines. And those vanishing lines, as it is in the case of all points perspective, whether it's 1 point or 2 point or 3 point perspective, we use those vanishing lines to kind of guide us and demarcate the areas in which we form our structure. So that's always a key factor for perspective drawing, using your vanishing lines as the area or the demarcated area in which you will draw a structure. So with 3-point perspective, again, what we'll do is, because we have this third vanishing point at the bottom of our page, when we draw vertical lines, those vertical lines should flow to that third vanishing point, as opposed to moving down the page in a perfect vertical line. And what this will do is just kind of give the 3-point perspective cube a little bit more of a distorted look, and kind of give it a more fish-eyed angle point of view in terms of how the viewer is seeing the structure in a three-dimensional space. Now, this little difference between 2-point perspective and 3-point perspective makes a world of difference in terms of how it shifts the point of view of how the structure is seen. So with 3-point perspective, simply by integrating that third vanishing point at the bottom of the page and using it to construct your object, you create a little bit more of a distortion in the point of view at which the object is being seen. Now, just make sure that once you have established your vanishing lines within your 3-point perspective drawing and have connected all the vanishing points with vanishing lines, you can then use those vanishing lines to establish the rest of the structure. And that's where you can set up the top surface area of the cube by drawing these corner points that connect again to the vanishing points on the horizon line. And in doing so, you will slowly start to see how the top surface area of that cube structure forms. But otherwise, guys, that is the general process of how to go about a 3-point perspective drawing and how to establish a structure using the principles of 3-point perspective. Just remember, there are some key principles when it comes to perspective drawing, whether it is 3-point perspective, 2-point perspective, or 1-point perspective. The first thing we want to understand is how many vanishing points we are working with. Once we understand that, we can start to think about where along the surface area of our page are we going to draw our structure, and that is where we start to consider the horizon line as this eye level indicator in terms of how the structure will be seen from the viewer's angle. So whether we draw it below the horizon line or above the horizon line will change the perspective of the structure and the angle from which it is seen. The next thing is to then use the vanishing points to establish vanishing lines, and within those vanishing lines is where you will establish your three-dimensional structures. So if you use the vanishing points to establish vanishing lines, you will always have an accurate representation of a three-dimensional structure in a three-dimensional environment. But otherwise, guys, that is it from me today. I hope this tutorial was helpful. I hope there are some key principles and concepts to take away in terms of how to establish perspective drawings and using the rules of perspective in order to do so in an accurate way. If you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below. If you'd like more videos related to this topic, please do like this video and subscribe. That helps us to grow the channel and ultimately enables us to make more art related content for you guys. Otherwise, guys, thanks again. Until next time, cheers.